What is up, Boxer A Push family? This is your quick 30-minute recap of our live learning experience from week one of A Push 2020-2021. I'm going to attempt to do this every week for you, just to kind of recap the key ideas of what we went over in class live. That way, if anything was a little bit confusing to you, or if you had to miss a little chunk of class, you still have access to the really important big ideas. So this isn't going to be nearly as in-depth as what you would have gotten in an in-class live experience, but it is going to make sure that you're not necessarily lost on some of the big important key topics that were covered this week in class. So first we talked about the idea of salutary neglect. Salutary neglect comes from this British policy of leaving the colonies alone on purpose, because the colonists have left largely without state funding. England hasn't paid for them to leave, largely without state protection. England is not providing any sort of military protection, naval protection for these colonists. So they're really leaving these colonies alone to develop on their own. And because of that, they develop their own real identity that becomes altogether separate from the British Royal Empire identity. And that's going to lead to some struggles between the two opposing sides of the Atlantic later on. But it's important to understand why the colonists are largely left alone. And the reason to that, the answer to that question really is the idea of mercantilism. So the English government's going to, for the most part, leave the colonies alone until the 1650s under this policy of salutary neglect. As you know from our last learning experience with your Monday core content video, Jamestown, of course, is founded in 1607. The New England colonies begin in 1620. So we have a long period of time in which the colonies are struggling and growing on their own without any protection or help from their mother country, which is going to lead to a sense of identity that is separate from England, because in a sense they feel like they've made it on their own. Beginning in the 1660s, though, King Charles II is going to pivot this policy to largely still leave the colonies alone politically and socially, but to become more hands-on, more regulatory within the colonies in terms of their economics. And this is going to be an attempt by the British to maximize their profits, to make sure that they're using all of their colonies to further their financial interests of England. The whole goal of economics in the world stage at this point is to buy as little as possible from other countries and to sell as much as possible to other countries. So England, a relatively small island with few natural resources, is kind of stuck in this situation in that they're going to have to buy a lot of their stuff from their competitors, right? The Spanish, the French, the Dutch, unless they can use their colonies to provide them with the raw materials that they would need to supplement what they have at home. So beginning in 1660, King Charles II is going to launch this policy of what's called mercantilism. And it's this policy that we should be using our colonies to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And when our country is stable economically, it also will become so militarily and politically. But to do so, the British are going to have to start regulating the colonies a little more closely than they had before. Now, this regulation doesn't come in the form of political regulations or social regulations, but rather regulations on who the colonies can trade with and who the colonies can buy from. So the mercantile doctrine insists that a government regulates trade so that their colonies function only to ship raw materials back to the mother country, and the colonies can only purchase manufactured goods also from that mother country. So it becomes this economic codependency, as the colonies are reliant on their mother country for two things, right? First, as a market for their goods, and second, as a way in which they can acquire manufactured goods that they need for stability and success. So mercantilism really is this blueprint for the British Empire. The British want more money. The British want a more favorable balance of trade, meaning they're exporting to other countries, not colonies, but other countries, competing nations, more than they're importing from those same nations. They want to eliminate their Dutch rivals in this Atlantic system of exchange. The Dutch also have a robust trading network. And to do so, they want a stronger navy, and the base of all of that, the foundation of all of that, is mercantilism. So to do so, they're going to restrict colonial trade. Two ways. These navigation acts are important in that they are what I call mercantilism 101, right? The very basics of mercantilism. So mercantilism is the theory. The navigation acts is how this theory would put into practice. The Navigation Act of 1660 is going to insist, mandate legally, that all raw materials that are produced in the colonies, so tobacco, sugar, cotton, rice, indigo, rosin, tar, lumber, etc., all of that can only be sent to English ports. They can't sell it to Spain, can't sell it to the French, can't sell it to the Dutch. If it's produced in the English colonies, it has to be shipped to England. Likewise, on the back end of that, when the colonists are buying things, ships cannot come into the colonies to sell and to trade unless that ship was made in England. So it's an attempt on England to control for both sides of things, the raw material side and the sale, manufactured goods side of things. The Second Act in 1663 added a caveat, added another piece that says anything that's shipped to the colonies, wherever it was from, has to come through England first, so that they pay a tax at the port in England to the English treasury, and then of course that increases the end game price on that good when it gets to the colonies. So both of these things are just meant to regulate not the commerce amongst the colonies themselves. They're going to leave the colonies to kind of do that on their own, but the commerce between the colonies and Europe and other European nations. So it looks like this, right? All these European countries are just trying to increase their treasury by exporting more than they import. And really the foundational way of doing this is ensuring the colonies here provide all their raw materials to the mother country and purchase back manufactured goods. So some of the impacts that are really important, the Navigation Acts have some positive and some negative impacts on the colonial development. First, New England, the region, of course, that we talked about on Monday that has much rockier, weaker soil and a shorter growing season, so not as robust of a place for cash crop or large-scale agriculture. They do have a lot of forests. So New England's shipbuilding industry thrives because if all ships have to be made in England, the New England colonists are like, well, we're part of England, and we have a lot of wood, so let's make some ships. It becomes a thriving industry for New England. Second, because now the British look at the colonies as an investment, as part of their financial portfolio, so to speak, they want to protect those colonies, and will do so by using the military, largely the British Navy, to protect the colonists from the French and the Spanish. Two positives. A downside is really going to curtail or limit colonial manufacturing. Because the colonists, why would you have the investment and the time and the effort to industrialize if you can always purchase your manufactured goods from your mother country? And fourth, I think logically as well, because the colonists are buying manufactured goods from somewhere else, from England, it's going to cause them to pay higher prices for those manufactured goods. This is what the system as a whole looks like. We refer to this as the Atlantic system of exchange. We see coming from England to all over their empire, manufactured goods, and coming from all over their empire back to England is raw materials. The raw materials, of course, are dependent on where it's coming from. We see here the New England region are sending back things like fish and furs, things that don't require good, strong agricultural soil. Whereas from the Chesapeake, we're seeing tobacco sent back. From the Deep South, we're seeing rice and indigo sent back. The middle colonies are shipping out grain, right? We talked about them as the breadbasket colonies. And also part of the system of exchange is, of course, a huge importation to both the West Indies and to a smaller extent the Atlantic seaboard of African slaves, as Africa is also purchasing manufactured goods at the expense of slaves that are being shipped to multiple parts of the New World. Another way to look at it is here. Again, the thing to note is that what's coming across the Atlantic Ocean towards the colonies in general is manufactured goods. What's going back towards Europe is raw materials. Now, it's not just goods that are being exchanged. It's not just goods at all. With all these goods that are being exchanged is a significant amount of immigrants and population that is coming to the New World as well. Now we look at the American colonies here on the Atlantic seaboard as one of the more diverse places in the world at this time. Now, this doesn't mean like diversity like we think about it in 2020, but rather diversity as we think about it different kinds of European, different cultures, different religions commingling in the same general area. We see it's a map worth noting. We see a significant English population along the Atlantic seaboard with some Dutch population mixed in here in New York, which of course used to be New Amsterdam. We see out on the frontier, it's a very important term and an idea that's going to kind of develop throughout American history, at least through the first semester. We see a significant population of German immigrants, as well as Scots-Irish immigrants that are settling on the frontier where it's less developed, less established, less English. But this level of diversity is important to note in that like places like New England have very little diversity, which shouldn't surprise us because they're striving to create a perfect, pure, white Protestant society in which everybody looks, acts, and believes the same. So we shouldn't be surprised there's no diversity there. Likewise, Monday's video told you that the middle colonies here in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware had a significant amount of diversity, and then we see that reflected here on this map. So it's important to note also that here by the mid 1700s, there is a large portion of African slaves already present here on the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, as well as in the Chesapeake region around what was Jamestown, that's now blossomed into the Virginia colony. So even at this early stage of colonization, the presence of African slaves is significant. Population is going to grow quite quickly. By 1775, on the verge of the American Revolution, population has grown from 250,000 to 2.5 million, so 10 times growth in just 75 years. And that's for a couple factors. Factor one, a ton of immigration. But factor two, forced migration of Africans to America to serve as slaves. Factor three is a very high birth rate. Both the Europeans and the Africans who are living in the colonies are having a lot of kids. Now, like I just mentioned, we see a significant amount of diversity, mostly in the middle colonies. In our northern or New England colonies, there's far less diversity, mostly English, mostly around the family, mostly uniform culturally, socially, and religiously. Whereas in the southern and the Chesapeake colonies, much of the diversity owes to slaves, but we do see on the frontier of the South a significant portion, if I go back, of Scottish and Scotch-Irish individuals that are living on the frontier. So that's kind of our demographics. We talked in the Monday video about the system of indentured servitude. And at this point, I'm going to make sure that you've read the letter home from Richard Frethorn, the indentured servant writing from Virginia, in which he really outlined some of the problems of indentured servitude. Now, indentured servitude is a great system of labor for the colonists until the indentured servants start living long enough to start asking for the back end of their bargain. Right? The idea is they're going to work for 5 to 7 years and then get a nice plot of land to start their life and have what they didn't have in Europe and England specifically, which was land, property, and the ability to improve themselves. So indentured servants, when they're all dying before the 5 to 7 years are up, they cause no problems. It's when they begin outliving their contracts that they're like, hey, where's that land I was promised? Hey, I want some political representation. I want some rights. So a lot of these indentured servants who've outlived their term of service are going to be quite upset at the establishment of the elite planter class in Virginia, who's rich and has all the power, and that's going to lead to a very noteworthy, significant turning point rebellion in American political history, which is Bacon's Rebellion. So these former indentured servants are living on the frontier, right, where it's rougher, it's tougher, it's less established, it's more dangerous. The land is less fertile, it's less developed, they have less stability around them, and they're upset for two reasons. One, tobacco prices have gone down significantly. One of the reasons being that Virginia is planting so much tobacco that they flooded the market with enough tobacco to drive down the price. Not tobacco. Second reason is because they're out on the frontier, they're in closer contact with the Native Americans who are upset about them being out there in closer contact with the Native Americans who are attacking their settlements. They've asked for support and help from the royal governor at the time, William Berkeley, who has refused to help them, largely because he sees them as a lower class of Virginia society that doesn't deserve the help of this more elitist government. So Bacon leads a rebellion against Berkeley, and it's important to note that this rebellion it cuts across racial lines and it cuts across gender lines. It's small farmers, former indentured servants, free and enslaved African Americans, and women that all work together to rise up against the upper class of Virginia society. So really, it's not a race rebellion, it's much more of a class rebellion of the poor against the rich. They march into the capital of Virginia, they burn things down, they get wild. The rebellion itself ends up being unsuccessful. The rebellion fails, several rebels are killed, but this is going to cause plantation owners to pivot their labor source from, instead of relying on indentured servants who eventually are going to be free and want land and demanding political rights, they're going to realize those people are too much trouble because they're going to start getting demanding at some point. What we can do instead is rely more heavily on what's already been coming into the colonies, but more slowly, African slaves. Rely on them as our free labor source instead, because there's no end of the term of service, right? They're property that will stay as property until they die. And when they have kids, their kids will become property as well. So it becomes a more viable investment financially and socially to invest in African slaves, which is one of the reasons we see this pivot here from indentured servitude to slavery as the staple labor source of these southern colonies. Um, what this demonstrates to society is that when the social class at the bottom is united across race lines, they're incredibly dangerous. But if we can divide them into white versus black, then the lower class becomes less dangerous to the established elite in society. So planters are going to use this racism to manipulate poor whites into thinking that at the very least they shouldn't be rebelling because they're not slaves. So this class divide is going to carry us through for much of American history that is worth noting, and it really begins most noteworthy with Bacon's Rebellion. So this helps visualize what happens at the beginning. The labor source in the Chesapeake and the South is mostly white indentured servitude, and they're largely dying before their term of service is done. There's a shift in this labor system as their mortality declines. They begin outliving their terms of service, and they start making the demands of what they were promised. Bacon's Rebellion falls right in the middle of this time period, and by the 1720s, we see a more race-based slavery taking hold in the colonies. Now, at this point, I'm going to insist that you read the two side-by-side historian excerpts that both have different views on why slavery takes such hold in American society. One will argue that it was because slaves were living longer, it became a wiser investment because you could own somebody that would work for you for a longer period of time, and the other has a different take on it. But read them both; they both have valuable perspectives for why slavery takes hold in American society in the late 16 and early 1700s. So in Virginia and South Carolina specifically, as well as the other southern colonies, there's a huge population of slaves, which allows the black populations to maintain some of their African culture because they are surrounded by a significant density of other Africans. Not that all the people coming from Africa have the same culture, they do not, but this is going to create the beginnings of what becomes African American culture into today. That is a blend of culture from Africa, culture from America, and culture from elsewhere. By 1720, in the American colonies, the African population has become self-sustaining, meaning they're having enough children to sustain the population themselves without any more importation of slaves, which is going to be one of the reasons why the slave population grows so rapidly in the next 140 years before the Civil War. Now, there's far fewer black people in the New England and the Middle colonies, but that does not mean to say that there's no slaves there at all. One way to differentiate is the southern colonies and the Chesapeake colonies have a slave-based society, meaning everything is built on slavery, their culture, their economics, their political systems, whereas the New England and the Middle colonies have societies with slavery. So good differentiation to note that slavery is everywhere, but slavery is the foundation of the entire society in the southern colonies. Slave demographics here, the map demonstrates for us via these darker colors that there are, in fact, more slaves per person in the southern colonies from Maryland on south. Now, why? Why does slavery grow? Cost. Indentured servants are coming at a smaller rate because the English economy has improved. There's a higher availability, so price goes down. And because of Bacon's Rebellion and other events, there's this fear of a growing number of landless, free white men that would cause trouble. There are some significant rebellions to note in the early colonial period. In 1739, slaves in South Carolina rise up in what's called the Stono Rebellion. They rise up against the slave ownership class in South Carolina. And like what will happen for the rest of the slave rebellions we cover in this class, the rebellion ends up being short-term successful, but long-term a failure, and will always result in the white society tightening the restrictions on the slaves to try to maintain their control without any more rebellions happening. Cool. So pivoting from that, we need to then talk about some of the political developments real quick in our last 5 minutes. The first of which is the creation of the Dominion of New England. Now, I told you at the beginning that the colonists were largely left alone politically. That doesn't mean that the British don't try to assert a little more control, but every time they do, it is rebuffed or pushed back by the colonists. The Dominion of New England is created in the 1680s to try to put all of New England, this region of the northeast of America, as well as New York and New Jersey, under royal control, to treat them as one big colony with one royal governor who would tell them all how to live their lives and what to do. So it's this administrative union of Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island and New York and New Jersey, each of these colonies that was previously kind of running itself. Uh, Put in charge of the Dominion of New England is a governor named Edmund Andros, and the colonists lose their mind. They rebel. They're burning Edmund Andros in effigy, meaning like little cutouts that's supposed to look like him. They're burning him at the stake to try to intimidate him. There's rebellions. There's the overthrow of the governor. People are very upset because even here, 70 years into colonization, the New England colonists are already used to being left alone. So they're quite upset by this, what they see as a usurpation or a taking away of their power. And the British government backs off. They say, never mind. We didn't realize you felt that strongly. Never mind. We're good. We'll leave you alone. Do your thing. And what that reveals is by now the colonists have already begun to establish their own sense of identity that's separate from England, but also that the British government doesn't want to try that hard to control them closely as long as they continue to benefit from them economically. Now, this is why the colonies in general are used to self-government. It's a very important term for period two, as each of the regions has their own style of self-government, but each of the regions does in fact govern themselves. And when I say govern themselves, I still do mean that it's largely only white males that have the power. However, the political control is local, meaning the power is local, not way across the ocean in England. In New England, the main source of political power are town meetings, a much more direct form of democracy, in which there's issues at hand, taxes, paying for schools, whatever the issue may be. All the colonists in the town who are eligible, so usually in New England it's church member males, come to the town meeting and they all vote directly on these key issues. So it's a much more direct form of democracy. Whereas the middle colonies and the southern colonies are going to use much more republican or representative styles of democracy, meaning people will vote for their representatives, and the representatives will go to some sort of an assembly and make the decisions for them. In the middle colonies, these assemblies are going to reflect the rights of Englishmen, private property, free press, those types of things, and are going to reflect some of the diversities that exist in the middle colonies. Whereas in the southern colonies, much of the power, almost all of the power, will be held by the wealthy planter class. So this development of colonial democracy is key because we're going to see some of these characteristics later when we talk about things like the Articles of Confederation of the Constitution. But it's important to note that because the British left the colonists to govern themselves, these early forms of American democracy are going to be birthed in this time period due to salutary neglect. So that's that for our little quick weekly wrap-up. I hope that was helpful. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns or you need a little bit further clarification or an additional resource, you just let me know at any time. I'd be happy to help you out. Thanks, y'all.